with me. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. One more time. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Bet you weren't expecting that, were you? That's kind of the point. God gifts all of us with not only talents or abilities and stuff that's unique, but he has plans for it. This particular accordion was given to me by June Machino several years ago, and her only request was that we use it sometimes in worship. And we just did. Good job. But here's the thing. Thank you. I hope that's fun, but again, this is where we're going today. God gifts each one of us with unique opportunities and unique gifts and unique all kinds of things with a purpose. And my prayer for each one of us today is that we'll either remember that and recommit to that purpose, or in one way or another, maybe you know what it is, but you've never even gone there yet. This is going to be your day. Are we ready to go on a journey that'll take us there, I hope? Praise God. Say this out loud with me, if you would, please. Use what God gives you. One more time. Use what God gives you. That's the simple thing. Here's the thing. God gives gifts. Some of them are to everybody, or at least they're offered to everybody. His forgiveness, his love, Jesus, everything that God offers to the whole world is literally for the whole world. There's nobody that he wants to exclude. There's nobody that we're supposed to exclude. He wants everybody to come. And yet, he leaves a lot of the choices up to us. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that whoever believes in him will not perish," right? He sent his son so that whoever makes that choice to believe in him. In Hebrews, we're told that God's word is living and active. It's sharper than any double-edged sword. It's able to penetrate the deepest parts of all of us. And yet, Paul reminds us in Romans that how are we going to believe unless we hear? How are we going to hear unless somebody tells them? Somebody has to make that choice to share the truth. Every single part of this, God offers it all to everybody, but it depends on choices that we make. I don't know what God's asking you to make, what kind of choice he wants you to make this morning. Some of the ones we've looked at recently are these. One was 2 weeks ago, we looked at an unlikely, lesser-known story of Abraham, one of the ones we don't tell all the time. And we remember together that we're supposed to always tell the truth. And that's not just not telling lies. Not telling lies is bare minimum, but to tell the truth means every day intentionally we're trying to tell the truth with our words and with our actions. That people will see us and they'll see the truth that God has put into us. That they'll see what he is calling them into. Last week we looked at a lesser known part of the story of the fall of Jericho, where Joshua had that huge victory, and yet then there was all kinds of problems because of this guy named Achan. And we remember together we're never to keep secret sins. And again, that's the bare minimum. It's not just that God doesn't want you to have a secret sin. It's that he knows that when we try to cover up even a lie, if that's all it is, quote unquote, just all it is, a lie, you've got to have all these cover stories and keep track of who knows what. Do you know what I'm talking about? All that emotion, all of that stuff could be somewhere else. And what God is dreaming for all of us is not that we just stay inside of a fence or that we keep anybody out, but that we stay on the road he's marked out for us within the guardrails that protect us. That's the idea of moral boundaries we've been exploring. Today we're going to spend most of our time on a story from Judges about a guy named Ehud. Everybody who knows this story? A few of you. It's a lesser known story. All of these, that's why this series is called The Other Bible Stories. It's a crazy one. You'll see why it's not told as often as, say, David and Goliath. Okay? You'll see why in a second. But first, really quickly, let's go back to Romans. Paul says this. In his grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. Notice he doesn't just give us gifts. He gives us gifts for doing certain things well. So, if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, then serve well. If you're a teacher, then teach well. Second big thing I'd love for you to say out loud with me, if you don't mind, is this. Most of God's promises are conditional. Let's try that together. Most of God's promises are conditional. And we don't like to think about it that way because we like it better if God just randomly just blesses everybody the same. And he does do a lot. Jesus himself said that God causes the rain to fall on the righteous and the unrighteous. There's several other things that God just does for everybody. But so many of the things, even what we just said, what Jesus himself came to do was to save those who believe in him, those who put their faith in him, who live out their lives based on their faith in him. There's so many things where God says, you will seek me and you will find me when you seek for me with all your heart. It's not that he's trying to keep anybody else out. He's just saying, hey, this is available if you want it. If you've ever tried to get a higher education of any kind, there's a lot of really great grants available. There's a lot of scholarships available, but they don't just randomly hand them out to anybody. Even if you didn't do that much to earn it, you've still got to fill out a whole bunch of paperwork. How many parents know what I'm talking about? There's some work involved. You don't just randomly get that money. And you don't get that money unless you go to school. It's not that they're trying to keep anybody else out. It's just that this is there so you can get an education. Does this make sense? It's the same thing. So many of the things that God offers us, we only experience when we put all of our faith in him and actually do it. The Battle of Jericho itself was one of those amazing moments where they saw God's power. But I believe one of the reasons that Jericho was such a big victory was because what happened in a little place called Gilgal right before that. See, what happened was, as they crossed the Jordan, which is another miracle, God parts the waters. They walk through the Jordan River on dry land. They enter. They camped out at this place called Gilgal and went through a bunch of ceremonies to reconnect with God, to recommit to God. And then there at Gilgal, they built this monument out of old rocks that they had found in the middle of the river while it was dry. And so from that point on, anybody who went by Gilgal would see those rocks and they would go, yep, God does do miracles sometimes. Maybe we should trust him. Gilgal was this holy spot to them, at least for a while. We'll come back to Gilgal. Everybody say the word Gilgal. We're coming back to that in a second. I promise you it's going to go to the story of Ehud really soon. It's going there. But first, let's look at this. God gave them very specific warnings about what would happen depending on what they chose to do with the power and the blessing he was offering him. This is just one of several places that just lays it out so clearly. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 28. God said, if you listen to these commands of the Lord your God that I am giving you today. By the way, this is Moses speaking at this moment. If you listen to these commands of the Lord your God that I am giving you today, and if you carefully obey them, the Lord will make you the head and not the tail, and you will always be on top and never at the bottom. You must not turn away from any of the commands I'm giving you today, nor follow any other gods and worship them. He goes on. But if you refuse to listen to the Lord your God and do not obey all these commands and decrees I'm giving you today, all these curses will come and overwhelm you. Then he kind of lists a bunch of them. He kind of says, this is what's going to happen. And here's one very specific. It's relevant to our story today. He says, here's one of the things that will happen. The Lord will cause you to be defeated by your enemies. You will attack your enemies from one direction, but you will scatter from them in 7. You will be the object of horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Which is pretty much the exact opposite of what God had in mind. If you remember the promise he made to Abraham, and all of Abraham's descendants was if they would follow him, he would bless every kingdom of the world through him. And not just kingdoms, every group of people. That word in the Bible, nations, means a distinct group of people. It's not really a political entity. It's a group of people. He said, everybody in the world is going to be blessed through you and your family if you follow me. And here he lays it out. He says, you know what? If you don't, you're going to be a horror story to every nation. It's going to be the exact opposite. A couple more details and the rest of this story will make a little bit of sense at least. A lot of times when we think about the idols in the Old Testament, it's really hard for us from an American point of view, modern 2025 America, to kind of imagine, how could somebody really believe in a little statue? How could they really believe? It'd be like me praying to this microphone and really expecting the microphone to say something back. It's kind of weird. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But honestly, the way that they looked at these idols had more to do with, they were more symbols. They were more like how we have a cross here. We don't actually pray to that cross, but a lot of people find it very meaningful to come into a sanctuary like this and pray while looking at a cross. And the idols that they worshiped were more like that than they were that they really believed the statue was alive. Does that make sense? They had these pantheons of gods in Canaan before God's people got there. And two of them that you always see all the time were Baal and Ashtaroth. And it's hard to translate those words. They're sometimes a little bit different. People say them different. Baal, Ashtoreth, Asherah. It's all these. But these were two characters in the pantheon of the Canaanite gods. They had an idea kind of like the Egyptians, kind of like the Greeks and the Romans, that there's this team of big, powerful beings that kind of run stuff. What was especially disturbing about this particular pantheon was the sinful, really twisted, murderous, and immoral ways that they worshiped them. The other was their very names. The word Baal means Lord. And when the plural is Baalim, which means the Lords. That's what they called the whole pantheon. And God says he is the Lord. The name that we call God most of the time is either the Lord, which technically in English just means somebody who owns the land you live on, right? Technically. But we go, no, this is the guy in charge. And so we capitalize it. The capital L, Lord. Even the word God, we have this idea of some sort of a deity, whether they're real or not real. There's this deity idea. In English, we have that word God. We capitalize it, and we call our God, God, capital G, God. They saw these gods as the Lords instead of God. And they saw the king of the Canaanite gods, Baal or Baal, or however you want to pronounce it in English today, as the Lord. And for all those reasons and many more, God was especially angry about that. Got it so far? Okay, so now we move on. In the book of Judges, you see a cycle begin. After they conquer most of Canaan, there's only a couple little outposts they didn't take for various reasons. But they pretty much got the job done. God kept his promise. Things got done. Now this cycle starts. They instantly, as soon as Joshua dies, they turn to idolatry. They worship Baal and Ashtaroth and the other Baalim instead of God. And so then God keeps the warning or the promise, whatever you want to call it, that he made and says, look, there you go. I'm going to let your enemies take over. And then they would put up with that for quite some time, and then they'd cry out to God, and then God would rescue them. And if you want to read the book of Judges, which I do recommend, but it's a pretty rough book, you'll see this cycle over and over and over again. First time it happens is a guy named Othniel. The second one is Ehud. Here we are. We finally got to this story. Are you ready? I just want this to understand. It makes more sense if we understand. These aren't just pretend stories. This is not a parable that Jesus or somebody else made up to make a point. This is history. This is something that happened. It's in here so that we can learn something from it, but this is a real story that happened in a real moment in history at a real spot on this planet that you could go still visit today. Judges chapter 2, verses 13 and 15. They abandoned the Lord to serve Baal and the images of Ashtoreth. And this made the Lord burn with anger against Israel. So he handed them over to raiders who stole their possessions. He turned them over to their enemies all around. They were no longer able to resist them. Every time Israel went out to battle, the Lord fought against them, causing them to be defeated, just as he had warned, and the people were in great distress. One more thing to just clarify. The word that we translate as judge is actually a Hebrew word that's usually a verb in the original rather than a title. Shafat means to judge, but not so much the way we think. It's not about somebody wearing a black robe and sitting in a chair and hitting a gavel and saying what the penalty for something is going to be. It has more to do with establishing or reestablishing justice. So sometimes it can mean making sure that somebody who deserves punishment gets the punishment they deserve, which is a lot how we see the word judge. But it can also mean avenging or defending someone who has been unjustly accused of something or who is suffering in a way that they don't deserve. This term judge is not so much about being a legal judge as it is somebody that God raises up to put things right again. Something is wrong, something needs fixed, somebody gets raised up to put things right again. Reestablish righteousness, justice. That's what these judges are. So here's Ehud's story. Judges chapter 3, beginning with verse 12. Once again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. And the Lord gave King Eglon of Moab control over Israel because of their evil. Eglon enlisted the Ammonites and the Amalekites as allies. And then he went out and defeated Israel, taking possession of Jericho, the city of palms. And the Israelites served Eglon of Moab for 18 years. Did you hear what the new capital of Moab / Israel is at this moment in time? Jericho. The very spot that the big victory happened. The very spot where everybody had recommitted themselves to God at Gilgal, and then God had delivered them in that major way. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, that big thing, that big celebratory thing. This is so symbolic. It's a real thing that happened, but him taking over Jericho is one more way that God's just going, guys, this is what happened if you follow me. This is what happens if you don't. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord again raised up a rescuer to save them. His name was Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed man from the tribe of Benjamin. The Israelites sent Ehud to deliver their tribute money to King Eglon of Moab. Now, one thing that's interesting in the scriptures is we very, very rarely get a description of what people look like. Even Jesus himself, we don't really get a description of what he looked like. The closest we get is a prophet that said that there's nothing about his appearance that would make us want to worship him. That's not got anything to do with why we would worship him. That he's just a normal looking person. So when you see a detail, as you're going through the scriptures, when you see a detail given, like somebody's left-handed, or they're tall, or they're short, or whatever else, like, for example, Queen Esther is mentioned as being incredibly beautiful. The reason is because it has something to do with the story. It's not that God likes those people better or worse. It's something's about to happen. It's kind of foreshadowing. But pay attention. Esther was incredibly beautiful. What did she do? She won a beauty contest and got to be the queen. All right? That's how this works. So here's this guy. He's left-handed. That's what we know so far. Something's about to happen. The Israelites sent Ehud to deliver their tribute money to King Eglon of Moab. So, verse 16, so Ehud made a double-edged dagger that was about a foot long, and he strapped it to his right thigh. Why? Because he's Left-handed, that's right. So he keeps it here, where everybody else is over here. The guards of the king would naturally frisk you on this side. He's got a very small weapon hidden on this side, under the folds of his robe. Tracking so far? Okay, here we go. So he had made a double-edged dagger that was about 1 foot long. He strapped it to his right thigh, keeping it hidden under his clothing. He brought the tribute money to Eglon, who was very fat. So there's a detail. Pay attention. We're almost there. Now, this is an incredibly strange moment in this story because he goes to deliver this tribute, and that's all they ask him to do, but he, for some reason, puts a dagger in his stuff. So maybe God's already calling him. It doesn't lay it out. It sure looks like it as the story unfolds. You might agree with me. I think he knew what he was supposed to do. I believe it with all my heart. But the Bible doesn't specifically says, and God told Ehud, here's exactly what you're going to do. And so he did it. It just tells us what he did. Okay? We have to kind of read between the lines a little bit. But it looks like he knew exactly what he was going to do. But as you'll see, as we go through the story, sometimes he, like the rest of us so many times, we know what we're supposed to do, but we procrastinate. There's a movie, it's a crazy movie, I'm not really recommending the movie, but there's a scene, the whole idea of the story, it's called Rat Race. The whole idea of the story is these rich gamblers put a duffel bag of money on one end of America and dare a bunch of people to do whatever it takes to go get it. Whoever finds it gets it. Okay? So it's kind of like what we're talking about here. Whoever gets there gets the money. Whoever doesn't get there doesn't get the money. It's all about the choices you make. But the funny scene that haunts me about it is as they set this up and explain the rules, then the guy running it, he goes, go. And they all just sit there. And he goes, go. And they just sit there. And finally, one of them says, so when you say go, do you mean go? And he says, yeah. Right now, that guy behind me is winning because he's closest to the door. Go! And I feel like sometimes that's how Jesus must feel when he says, you know, remember 2,000 years ago I said, go into all the world? And you know what I'm talking about? And I know myself, for some reason, ever since I saw that movie, there's so many mornings I'm getting up and I just not feeling getting up yet, not feeling working out, not feeling fixing coffee. And I'm going, go, go. And I'm literally thinking about John Cleese yelling at me. And that's weird. And I'm not telling you you should. I'm just telling you that's how it happens. But Ehud, at least he goes to deliver the tribute money. He's prepared a little bit. I think he knows. I really do believe he knows what the plan is. But let's see what happens next. What he's going to do is he's going to go across the Jordan River, or at least in that direction, up to Jericho. And here we are in Joshua chapter 4, verses 19 to 20. Can we go back to that map for just a second, though, real quick? I just want you to see how this is laid out. It'll make what's happening next sense. See, up there in the top corner is Ai, or I. I always say it Ai, and I mess up. It's I. But that's where they got defeated last week. You've got Gilgal. That's the place we just said. There's the place they forded the Jordan River, and there's Jericho. It's all right next to each other. So just keep that in mind. The people crossed the Jordan. I'm sorry. I'm going to skip that one. We already told that part of the story. Let's keep going. We're back to Judges chapter 3, verse 18. Here we go. After delivering the payment, Ehud started home with those who had helped carry the tribute. But when Ehud had reached the stone idols near Gilgal, he turned back. Let's stop there for a second one more time. After delivering the payment, Ehud started home with those who had helped carry the tribute. He started the mission, handed off the money, and just left. But then something happens. But when Ehud reached the stone idols near Gilgal, he turned back. What used to be at Gilgal? Stone idols? A stone monument. That was a place where everybody walked by and remember how powerful God was. Just like Jericho was a place every time they went into town, they'd remember how powerful God was. Now Jericho had become a symbol for, hey, somebody else conquered us and runs everything now. And Gilgal, nobody tells us why or who or how it had happened, but instead of that monument, there's a whole bunch of idols. And something happens when Ehud goes back that direction toward the Jordan River. As he's walking back, he has what I would call a Gilgal moment. He goes, wait a second, this is not how this is supposed to be. When he sees those idols, instead of a monument to God, he goes, that's not the way it's supposed to be. That's not okay. And he turns around and he heads back. He came to Eglon and said, I have a secret message for you. So the king commanded his servants, be quiet, and he sent them all out of the room. Quick apologies to anybody with a squeamish stomach. I'm reading straight out of the scripture. I don't want you to think I made this up. Ehud walked over to Eglon, who was sitting alone in a cool upstairs room, and Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. As King Eglon rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, pulled out the dagger strapped to his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. The dagger went so deep that the handle disappeared beneath the king's fat. I told you, the details always come back. So Ehud did not pull out the dagger, and the king's bowels emptied. I'm reading it right out of the scriptures. Don't judge me. And then Ehud closed and locked the doors of the room and escaped down the latrine. Ehud has some stuff that I do not have. I once heard a story about a missionary who jumped into a pit that was like a sewage pit to save a baby that had fallen in there. And I literally got emotional thinking, I don't know if I could do that. I'm not a fan of germs. Anybody that knows me now, I'm just not. That's just gross. Well, this guy's not only doing this very violent thing that I wouldn't necessarily really want to do either, but he is gagged. He escapes through a latrine, swims out through the sewer like, ugh, but he gets the job done. We keep going. After Ehud was gone, the king's servants returned and found the doors to the upstairs room locked. They thought he might be using the latrine in the room, so they waited. Apparently this was a thing that happened often. But when the king didn't come out after a long delay, they became concerned and got a key. And when they opened the doors, they found their master dead on the floor. Meanwhile, verse 26, while the servants were waiting, Ehud escaped past the stone idols on his way to Sarah. Now this is cool, guys. Think about this for a second. Earlier, it was Ehud who was waiting on whatever he was about to do, and he heads to those idols and has his Gilgal moment and turns around. Now, they're still waiting. Man, he's been in there for a while. Think we should check on him? I mean, it does stink in there. We should probably check on him. They're doing that. Ehud is passing the idols again. And this time he's got momentum. Now, I hope and pray that he at least took a minute to jump in a creek or something. I'm hoping. But it doesn't tell us. Here's what it says. When he arrived in the hill country of Ephraim, Ehud sounded a call to arms, and then he led a band of Israelites down from the hills. Follow me, he said, for the Lord has given you victory over Moab, your enemy. And so they followed him. And the Israelites took control of the shallow crossings of the Jordan River across from Moab, preventing anyone from crossing. They attacked the Moabites and killed about 10,000 of their strongest and most able-bodied warriors. Not one of them escaped. So Moab was conquered by Israel that day, and there was peace in the land for 80 years. He reestablished justice. It's a gross story. It's a weird story. It's a strange story. It's kind of funny in places, at least to me. I have a dark sense of humor. But here's what I hope and pray that we get out of it today. Let's go back through the big ideas we just explored. First, use what God gives you. Maybe you're left-handed. That's a little unusual. Maybe whatever it is that God has gifted you with, the passions, the gifts, the talents, the skill sets, the experiences, the education, whatever it is about you that makes you you. Maybe it seems weird to other people. Maybe your whole life people have said, gosh, you're weird. Well, maybe you are. I think we all are. We're all unique, but we're uniquely gifted. Are you hearing me? We're uniquely prepared. Each one of us is prepared with specific things that God wants us to do. There are things that each one of you can do that I cannot. There's probably a couple things that I can do that you cannot. That doesn't make any of us better or worse. It's just how God set things up. Use what God gave you. Second thing, most of God's promises are conditional. This is not God trying to be mean. It's just, if you do this, this will happen. You got to do that. Imagine what would have happened if Ehud would have just kept on walking. Imagine if Ehud would have delivered the tribute and walked by the idols and said, man, that's too bad. It would have been a completely different story. Justice would not have been reestablished. Nobody would have been saved. Nobody would have been delivered. Why? Not because God wasn't powerful or because Ehud wasn't gifted or because everything wasn't in place and available for something amazing to happen, but because he just decided not to do anything. Guys, here's what I hope and pray. That each one of us this morning is going to have a Gilgal moment. Maybe it's going to be like Joshua in his Gilgal moment, where maybe where you are in your journey following Jesus right now is a really wonderful one. And so this morning, when we're going to stand and sing in just a couple more minutes, you're going to be just going, wow, God, thank you so much. I recommit to you more than I've ever committed to you in the first place. God, thank you. Help me never forget how good you are and what you've done for me in this season. Or maybe you're going to have a Gilgal moment kind of like Ehud. And you're going to go, I know what you want me to do, and I'm sorry it's taking so stinking long, but I can't take it anymore. I'm not going to let it keep on going like this anymore. Let's go. I hope you have a Gilgal moment of some sort this morning. I can't make that happen. I can't force you to. I can barely get myself to do the things I know what God wants me to do. But here's what I'm going to say. Ready, set, go. You know what go means? It means go. Go. Let's stand, let's sing, let's make the